Hello, friends, and we are starting in on another chapter of adolescent development. We are going to be talking about the self this week. Everybody loves to talk about themselves, and that is what we are doing, except I'm probably not going to talk a ton about myself, but more about the general self, not the me self. Although I'll probably sneak in some stories because I always do. Okay, we are talking primarily about how um, based on the psychological research, we understand ourselves and how that develops throughout adolescence and emerging adulthood, um, the sort of aspects of the self and what that means and how that affects a person's development and their interaction with the world around them. Unsurprisingly, based on the stuff that we've talked about so far in this class, culture has a lot to do with how we understand ourselves. Given that we are in a fairly individualistic culture in the United States, um, we tend to think a lot about ourselves, right? The individual tends to focus on the individual, and since you are the individual that most matters to you, then you are going to focus on yourself, right? Makes sense. In contrast, in more collectivistic cultures, the needs of the self are not prioritized. Rather, it is the needs of the group that are prioritized. And as a result, the level of thinking about the self tends to be less and tends to be more diffuse and more focused on what you can do in terms of your relationship with others rather than who am I and how do I need to satisfy my own needs. I phrase that perhaps a little bit negatively. I do think there are positives and negatives both in a more individualistic approach to the self and in a more collectivistic approach to the self. Um, Speaking more broadly, I sort of feel like every single psychological characteristic that a person can possess carries within itself both positives and negatives, right? We tend to valorize and prioritize certain kinds of personality traits and ways of being, but that's all wrapped up in our culture, right? So we think that it is best to be assertive and uh, straightforward and forthright and get what you want, right? And that is very useful in a lot of situations. However, too much focus on yourself in a situation where the focus is most properly on somebody else or on the group is going to cause problems, right? So, and that's true whether you're talking about sort of conceptions of the self or introversion or extroversion or levels of anger or levels of people pleasing or levels of whatever, right? While we tend to think of certain things as good ways to be and other ways as bad ways to be. Okay, here's, for example, uh, depressive tendencies, right? We think of those as bad. We want to get rid of those. They make us feel bad. No thanks, right? Let's have less of that. Yeah, sure, absolutely. There are lots of situations in which feeling sad and uninterested in the things that you like doesn't help. However, there are certain situations in which it is actually really useful to sort of stop and be a little bit more still and reflective and not necessarily on top of the world every single moment. Every single personality trait has appropriate moments and inappropriate moments, right? The things that are positive about it and things that are negative about it. So maybe thinking about that in a slightly more broad way than we tend to do in everyday life, especially in regards to yourself, might help you feel a little bit better about the things that you don't like about yourself. You are the way that you are because somewhere along the way it has served you, or else you'd do it differently, right? Okay, anyhow, I'll get off my soapbox. Um, Great. Let's talk about how the self develops, at least according to the research, during adolescence. Our understanding of who we are in terms of our personality and the things that we like, the things that we do, and the things that we avoid increases by leaps and bounds during adolescence because, as we've talked about previously. You've got all of this new brain complexity and function that is starting to come online and starting to become easier to engage in. So you can think about yourself more deeply and have a better sense of where you fit and where you don't. And this is one of the reasons why we think of adolescence as sort of this time of awakening and becoming yourself in a way that we don't tend to think of childhood as being. We get a stronger understanding of what our traits are, what it is that we are good at, what it is that we are bad at, both in terms of sort of physical activities and then also in terms of personality traits. What do I do best? Do people really like talking to me? Am I best at getting what I want? Am I really good at whatever the case may be? We start to understand that about ourselves in a way that we didn't previously. And that's a real change that comes about in adolescence. One of the things that we start to do is recognize that there are actually several different us's that we can and need to pay attention to. There is our actual self and then our possible selves, right? So the actual self, as you can probably tell by the name, is how we really are. Or I guess I should say it is how we perceive that we actually are, which may not necessarily reflect reality perfectly, but nevertheless is the best that we've got, right? All you know is what you know. And so you look around and see how people are responding to you, and you look at yourself as you are doing things and moving through the world, and you say, okay, this is who I am. But then, based on how we were raised and based on media representations of people like us and people our age, we develop possible selves as well. This is the us that we could be, right? You think back to your early teenage years, and you probably can remember at least some vague times of thinking, oh, I would like to be like this, or I could end up like that, right? Because there are actually multiple possible selves. That is the ideal self and the feared self. And the ideal self is the person we would like to turn out to be, the perfect version of ourselves that is, super fit and liked by everybody and able to do everything that we wish we could do and experiences no difficulties whatsoever, right? That's the ideal self. It's our superhero self, right? The person that would show up in the movie of our lives. Then there is the feared self, which is the person that we see that we could possibly become, but don't want to be. And a lot of times that takes the shape of, I see my dad doing that thing and I really don't want to be like that when I grow up. Or, oh, I just got in a fight and I worry that that's going to be a thing that I do, and I don't like that. I don't want to be that. What do I do about that? Or it can be any behavior that you engage in, where it's like, oh, I don't want to be that person, right? And a lot of that has to do with the feedback that we then get from the behaviors that we enact. Generally speaking, we tend to think something is bad if other people tell us it's bad or respond negatively to it. And that tends to lead us to not want to do that sort of thing again. Social influence is very strong, especially during adolescence. We'll talk about that later, where we are really sensitive to the feedback that people give us. And we want to get along. We want to be liked. We want to fit in. We want to have a place. And so if people really respond strongly negatively and push us away because of something that we've done, that behavior will likely become part of our feared self. That's not who I want to be, right? Now, there is another kind of self that has been studied that starts to show up in adolescence, which is the false self. This is the person that we present ourselves as being to the people around us. That is frequently, increasingly during adolescence, not a true reflection of who we are or even who we would like to be, but rather the person that we think other people want us to be, that hides, disguises, or lies about certain aspects of our actual self in order to gain more acceptance, right? So maybe this is the queer kid that then pretends to be straight in school so that they don't have to deal with like the negative consequences of that aspect of their self, and the negative feedback that they're likely to get from peers and adults. Or maybe it's the kid who really loves music and theater and the arts, but feels like that's a nerdy and bad and unacceptable thing to do, and so presents themselves as being more sporty or more physically inclined than they really are. Hey, that was me as a child. Yay! Yeah. Anyhow, all of us do this to a lesser or greater extent. There can be, based on the research, some negative consequences, as you might guess, to engaging too much in the false self. But I don't want to oversell that because it is something that we all do, right? You show up to a party and you're like, oh, I don't want to be here and I don't like these people. But hey, how you doing? I'm so glad to see you. It's been for ages, whatever. That's okay, right? We all do that to a certain extent, and it can be socially useful to get ourselves through a scenario or gain acceptance from people that we would otherwise struggle to gain acceptance from. And how much of our real self do they really need, deserve, or want anyway, right? So I want to give sort of a balanced view there. Yes, you spend too much time not being yourself around the people who are closest to you, and that tends to have some negative psychological effects in terms of development of anxiety and depression and other things. But it's not necessarily unhealthy to engage in some falseness in public arenas. A lot of times that is self-protective, necessary, and even good. Okay. Now, tied closely into our understanding of ourselves is the idea of self-esteem, which really started to gain traction in the 60s and 70s and has been a major aspect of psychological study in sort of self-psychology ever since, personality psychology as well. As we look at self-esteem, it tends to be very high during childhood and then take a real steep dip at the beginning of adolescence, and then gradually climb throughout adolescence and reaches another peak during emerging adulthood. Now, if you think about sort of the complexity of the self that develops during during adolescence, and the sort of cognitive complexity that I was talking about earlier, this makes a certain kind of sense. As we are able to think a little bit more clearly about how other people are evaluating us, the sort of naive optimism of childhood gets blown up, right? Just absolutely shattered. And you probably remember a little bit of this happening to yourself, where you were riding high on the things that you thought you were good at and really enjoyed and thought that you were just awesome at. And then at a certain point, you start to look around and realize, oh, wait, the people around me are not responding as positively to me as I do these things as I thought they were. Do I suck? Do I suck at this thing? This was actually really important to me. This was a part of who I thought I was, and I'm not good at it. Well, crap. I feel worse about myself. And your self-esteem drops. And because early adolescents tend to not be very good at very many things yet, because their bodies are still growing and they're going through puberty and things are changing and they don't know how to move their bodies and they don't know how to do the things that they would like to be really good at and that they see people being good at in movies and on TV shows and around themselves. Because generally speaking, adolescents don't compare themselves to others of their own age, but rather to sort of the ideal adolescence, which is usually like 17 or 18 years old. And when you're 12, you're just not going to be as good at most things as an 18-year-old is. And so you're like, oh, wait, I am awful at everything. I, therefore, am awful. Well, crap, I'm going to go sit in my room and feel bad, right? We all go through it. It's not pleasant. But it is a necessary step towards accurate self-evaluation. And we tend to overcorrect, right? We tend to think we are awful at everything when we start to understand that we are not awesome at one thing that we care about. And so you get this real dip in self-confidence and self-esteem that then gradually recovers as we gain more experience with sort of evaluating the messages that come in from others and stop taking every little negative bit of feedback or even neutral feedback, which we evaluate as negative, by the way. We stop thinking all of that stuff is super, super important as we gather more and more data over the years, right? It's like, oh, this person, I was playing the piano and this person was like, oh yeah, that was good. At first you're going to be like crushed, right? Oh, I'm just the worst. I'm never touching the piano again. But then after a certain amount of time, you realize, oh wait, this person is this kind of person that just doesn't get super excited about everything. So they probably did like it and I'm probably okay. And it's not that big of a deal, right? And so you start to like zero in on a more accurate level of understanding of how you are being evaluated by the people around you. And as you get older, those evaluations stop being quite so vital to our sense of self. It's one of the nice things about getting older. You stop giving quite so much of a crap about what other people think. It takes a long time. Don't worry if you're not there yet. I'm still not all the way there, and I'm 44, so it takes a while. But compared to the anxiety and like hit to the self-esteem that I felt when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, when somebody gives me some neutral or negative feedback, I can handle it a lot better now. Thank goodness, right? Imagine if you were stuck with the emotional highs and lows of being 12 or 13 for the rest of your life. Nobody would survive. It's terrible. This is compounded by the creation of what we call the imaginary audience during adolescence, which is the idea that we all tend to get, and this is more true in individualistic cultures than in collectivistic cultures, but it is broadly true for everybody. It's the idea that everybody's watching us, that everybody is zeroed in on you and every little thing that you are doing, and so anything that you do wrong is like magnified, right? It's that feeling again when you are walking into class in the 8th grade and like you've dropped some ketchup on your shirt during lunch and it feels like there's a bullseye painted around that stain on your shirt and that everybody just thinks you are a massive idiot and like you can't even focus on anything else because you are sure that every single person is like, look at that. That is so gross. You are so stupid, right? It's the imaginary audience. Everybody is looking at you. This happens even when we're alone at this age. You're like, oh no, if anybody saw me right now, they would be horrified by me. And you respond accordingly. Even though nobody's watching. And what you begin to realize, hopefully you have begun to realize at the age that you are at now, is that we are overstating that for ourselves. Like everybody else around us is so busy thinking that people are looking at their stain on their shirt that they are far too concerned to be worried about your little stain on your shirt. Yeah, people do notice little things here and there, but like it's much, much less than you think it is, especially as an adolescent. So, that really, again, multiplies the effect of this decrease in self-esteem that we're talking about during adolescence. Now, how much you worry about and how much self-esteem really matters to your concept of yourself depends on what culture you are in and your ethnic background as well. There are certain societies and certain groups for whom feeling good about yourself is more important. And again, you've got an individualistic versus collectivistic difference here broadly, but also within different families and within different ethnic groups, even here in the United States, you'll see differences. You can see, as is listed here at the bottom, African-American adolescents tend to have higher self-esteem than white kids or other ethnic groups here in the United States. And that is just broadly speaking part of that particular culture here. And that tends to have some really, like I was saying earlier, that has some really positive effects. And in certain situations, it can have some negative effects. It is actually really useful to not overestimate your own abilities, right? Think about watching a kid who is like trying to hit a T-ball off of like the little stand, right? And they totally whiff it. And the ball, on their fifth try, they hit the ball 2 feet, and they are so proud of themselves, and they bolt for first base, and they get there, and they look around. They're like, I'm awesome. Did you see that? That was the best, right? But all of the parents are like, oh, he's so cute. She's so cute. They think they're doing so well. Good job, kiddo, right? And when really they recognize, you really suck at this, but you're a kid and you're cute, and I don't want you to feel bad, so I'm going to cheer for you and I'm going to clap for you. Imagine having that level of sort of unearned confidence as an adult. That'd be a real problem. Now, I know you're thinking of that one person who you're like, yeah, they're still like that, right? These are like our politicians and our leaders who are like, I am awesome at everything, love me, worship me. And we're all like, will you just stop ruining the world, please? That is a personality trait that can survive into adulthood. Those tend to be really difficult people. But generally speaking, for us average mortals, we've got to learn what we're good at and what we're not, and that is going to involve somewhere along the way feeling bad about yourself as you realize, oh wait, I am not great at this thing. And that can lead you ideally to get better at the thing, to actually assess your performance more accurately so that you improve and become excellent in the way that you want to be, and then your self-esteem is restored and actually increases. And this is, broadly speaking, what happens throughout the course of adolescence, because as you get a little bit older, get to the later stages of adolescence, you actually do start to be excellent at certain things. And you do start to look the way that people want to look in our society. And as a result, you tend to feel better about yourself, right? Okay, I think I've said enough about that. You can see then this sort of rising level of self-esteem throughout adolescence, through emerging adulthood, and you tend to hit a fairly stable high level of confidence and self-esteem once you hit full adulthood, mature adulthood. Now, of course, there are going to be individual differences here. There are individuals who struggle with mood disorders and anxiety and all sorts of other things that are going to negatively impact self-esteem. But even for those folks, their self-esteem is likely to be higher as an adult than it was as a teen, right? Okay, we've got some different researchers, of course, who talk about self-esteem differently and talk about sort of different aspects of self-esteem. The classic one is Rosenberg, who came up with a self-esteem scale that still gets used today whenever I'm measuring self-esteem in any of the research that I do. Not that I do much research these days. I use the Rosenberg scale because it's really reliable and it's been used for ages. Now, he differentiates between what he calls baseline self-esteem and barometric self-esteem. Baseline self-esteem is how you feel about yourself generally, right? Sort of your trait level of self-esteem. Some people have really high self-esteem. Some people have moderate self-esteem. Some people have low self-esteem. And then there is, he also talked about barometric self-esteem, which is moment-to-moment fluctuations in how you feel about yourself and your self-esteem, right? Because even somebody who is super high in their average level of self-esteem, sort of in their personality, can have a really bad day where they're like, I suck. I am just going back to bed. No thanks, right? Or, maybe someone with normally low self-esteem has a really good day and then feels great about themselves. That's the difference between barometric self-esteem and baseline self-esteem. And you could think of those as waveforms, like you could actually combine them, and you tend to operate in this range, and that's your sort of baseline self-esteem. But within that variability, then you'll get extra highs and lows that are based on what's going on in that particular day, right? If you care to think about it that way, or it's useful at all. If not, you can delete that from your consciousness. I will not be offended. Okay, Harter, on the other, Harter talked about the different domains of self-image and self-esteem, which have become increasingly important and increasingly broadly studied as time has gone on. Because you can have, especially in adolescence, parts of yourself that you feel really good about, and then other aspects of your existence that in which your self-esteem is really low, right? So you can see the 8 that he listed out here: scholastic competence, social acceptance, athletic competence, and down on the line, right? I remember one of my really good buddies who was one of my best friends in high school, who just was awesome at most things, and so felt really good about himself, was a happy dude sort of all of the time, and felt like he was awesome because he actually was awesome. Except when it came to dating, he could not get a girl to like stick with him to save his life. And he felt terrible about it, and we talked about it a lot, and like tears were shed and sad music was listened to on a regular basis when the next girl rejected him. And he struggled with that all the way through his teen years and into emerging adulthood until finally started to settle down, right? So his self-esteem was really high in a lot of these other domains, but when it came to romantic appeal, he was down in the gutter, and it took him a long time to figure that out. And so you can see sort of like for different individuals, each one of those can be at a different level. You could probably pretty accurately gauge how you feel about yourself on each one of these 8. Might be a good idea, if you haven't stopped to think about it before, to just pause for a second and like think about that for a sec. Look at each one of these and go, where am I at? How do I feel about myself on each one of these? And then if you're really feeling like doing the work, you can say, how accurate am I being on each one of these? Where does this sense of self-esteem, whether it's high or whether it's low, where does it come from? What is the evidence that I have for each one of these things? You could spend hours like journaling on this stuff, and it would probably be really useful for you, because I promise you that there is something that you feel bad about yourself for that you don't need to, that you are actually doing much better than you think you are, and you just haven't stopped to realize that the habitual ways that you think about yourself are not entirely accurate. Just because our accuracy increases throughout adolescence doesn't mean we then get laser accuracy on all aspects of self-appraisal once we hit 18, right? It just doesn't work that way. So if you want to do that, it's a good idea. All of us could handle doing that. Okay, when we look at those 8, the ones that tend to be most important in terms of their impact on your overall global self-esteem are physical appearance, unsurprisingly, and social acceptance, right? Especially during adolescence, how you look really matters to you. And again, especially here in our society in the United States, we are so focused on media perceptions of beauty, excuse me, both for men and women, that if we cannot measure up to the ideals of beauty, we feel really bad about ourselves, which means that everybody ends up feeling bad about themselves. You want to hear something crazy, something truly wild? The research into self-esteem, even at adult levels, you want to know the group of people that actually has the lowest body image scores? Supermodels. That's how screwed up we are. The folks that everybody else looks to and says, I want to look like that, actually feel worst about their bodies, because they are the ones who actually get the most focus on every single inch of their skin and every single possible flaw that they could have. And so even though they are the paragons of beauty that everybody else looks to, all they can think about is the fact that their nose has to get photoshopped, or they've got this one blemish, or their stomach is not perfectly flat. There's this one little tiny bit of cellulite or whatever, because there's so much focus being put on them, right? It's messed up. It's truly messed up. But if you want to talk about who is focusing most on those sort of media messages about beauty and physical flawlessness, it's adolescence, right? And so looking good, and getting messages from your peers that you are looking good is going to do the most for adolescents in terms of them feeling good about themselves. That is followed closely by social acceptance, right? You can be funny looking, But so long as you've got a group of friends that you can hang with and that really accept you and really like you, you're still going to feel pretty decent about yourself, right? And then as you get through adolescence and you get out of the horror and hell of high school, then things start to improve, right? And there's a couple of you who are like a year or two out of high school are like, does it though? Does it really? Yes, it really does. You may not be feeling it yet, but I promise you, give it another 5 years, and you can look back on how you felt in high school. And unless things are seriously wrong in terms of your mental health and wellness that has gone wrong since high school, you are likely to feel much better about yourself than you did in high school. A lot of this is because we start to, like I was saying, get more accurate in our self perception, especially when it comes to physical appearance. It's like, okay, so I'm not a 10, but I'm also not the 2 that I felt like I was. I am like a solid 6, okay? I don't know if I'm a solid 6. I don't actually even pay attention enough anymore to know. But, you start to get a little bit more accurate in assessing where you are in terms of physical appearance. And as your thinking continues to deepen, you begin to realize that there are more important things than looking super good. You look at the folks who were like the beauty queens in high school and the beauty kings, and you realize, oh, they actually have a lot of real problems in their life. Maybe there's some other things that I need to be paying attention to. And you start to put a little less importance on physical appearance and a little bit more importance in excellence and in other aspects, other domains of your life. You also tend to be getting along better with your parents. That's nice, right? You move out and suddenly a lot of that pressure decreases. It doesn't go away. That never goes away. But it does get a little bit more manageable as you've got more freedom and more ability to make more of your own decisions. And you tend to have more control over the contexts of your life. Like, oh, wait, I actually hated school and I hate sort of academic stuff. I am going to go do something else. I am done with my mandatory education. Peace out. I'm done. Now, I know that's not anybody I'm talking to here because you're here listening to me. My apologies. But you have picked this context, right? Nobody held you at gunpoint or forced you, said that they were going to send your parents to jail if you did not go to college, right? Which, can happen in younger years for student education, for adolescents. Yeah, so that's a difference. Okay, and when we talk about where self-esteem comes from and what causes it, and then what hurts it, you've got these things that end up being the biggest indicators of whether or not somebody feels good about themselves in adolescence. Are they accepted and approved by others? Top of the line. How are their primary relationships in their life with their parents and with their siblings? Do they feel like they have a context in which they gain approval outside of the home? Are they? Is that school, or is that sports, or is that music, or what is it, right? And then, am I doing well at school? Because that is a huge part of adolescent life, especially in our society. And if you do well, I mean, honestly, you don't have to have all of these. If you can have even one or two of these, you're going to feel decent about yourself, even if it's not all of the time. You've got that domain-specific self-esteem. And so long as you can feel good about yourself some of the time, you can get through the day, right? All right. I'm going to cut us off there, and we'll come back and talk about the rest of the stuff here in a minute.